it's important that I preface my remarks with the fact that I'm not a biologist. I'm a historian of science, and I specialize on this period and these people. Now, the reason I call this In Search of the Historical Wallace is to make a distinction between the historical real person and the Wallace known to most people in the world today, who is a legendary figure of ever-growing mythology. So I want to take you through the life of the real Wallace, the story of the real historical man. I mean, it starts off with trying to emphasize as many differences as possible between Wallace and Darwin. This is how the story always evolves. Darwin was, of course, very wealthy and privileged. He was. But Wallace's belonging to supposedly the other side of the social spectrum is strongly overemphasized. These are Wallace's parents. Wallace's father was a gentleman. It says so in Wallace's birth certificate. But he did fall in hard times. But look, they would fit seamlessly into any Jane Austen costume drama, wouldn't they? Right? These are not farm laborers. So Wallace is born in, well, modest circumstances. Later, he is sent to the best school that his parents could afford. A school that advertised itself as a school for the sons of gentlemen. And his education there would have been the same as Darwin's had been at school. But next myth. Just in the last few years, this myth has arisen and become widely disseminated, which is that Wallace's family money ran out and he was forced to leave school early. This is simply not correct. Wallace left school at the normal leaving age of 14. That was when everyone left a grammar school in those days. So Wallace obviously had to make his own way in life. University was never going to be an option. And what to do? He worked various odd jobs as a surveyor. He worked as a school teacher at Leicester, something that was only possible because he was well educated. He could teach pupils. But there was going to be something, which of course perfectly overlaps with the events today, that would change Wallace's life, which was the Victorian obsession with natural history collections. This is a scene from the British Museum. Just look at it for a second. Look at that room full of dead things. Where do you get dead things? Someone has to go out and get them, right? Collectors were needed, and therefore there was a market that a collector could supply. Here's a view of the hummingbird house, which is remarkably similar to the hummingbirds on display downstairs, but maybe the same one, I don't know. So Wallace set off with his friend Henry Walter Bates for the Amazon to work as collectors. Next myth. Wallace did not go to the Amazon to solve the problem of the origin of species. This is another romantic myth. Wallace went to be a commercial collector, as 100% of his references to this event testify. Well, he made a good living for 5 years, but sadly, as we've already heard, his ship caught fire in the middle of the Atlantic on his way home and sank. And Wallace and crew were shipwrecked for some time. They were rescued. And he made it back to London, which, judging from this photograph, I think he was fattening himself up after the long period of privations. This is the chubbiest I've ever seen Wallace in this photograph. But decided he was not daunted. He was going to do it all again, to go on another collecting expedition, but this time on a much grander scale. And since the Amazon was full of other collectors already, Southeast Asia seemed like the place to go. So he arrived here in 1854. This painting is actually almost exactly where we are now. Looks a little bit different than today, doesn't it? From Wallace's day. Here's another view of the bustling Singapore of Wallace's day. He probably stayed in the house in the bottom of this photograph was called the London Hotel. I think he may have stayed there. But he soon moved into the wild interior of the island at a place called Bukit Timah. very wild. And here he started his first serious collecting. During my research on Wallace in Singapore, I wanted to not take any of the old stories on faith, which they had always just been reproduced again and again, such as Wallace's claim that the tigers in Singapore killed about a person per day. This has just been endlessly repeated. Question, well, I actually checked. No. About 20 people were killed by tigers in the year that Wallace wrote that. Not 365. It's a huge difference. In fact, Wallace was just told a local legend that every visitor to Singapore was told that. And then they'd go home and they'd write in their books or in the newspaper, gosh, in Singapore, tigers kill a person every day on average. It was never true. But it's a great story. And Wallace was not immune to these stories. In the end, he spent 8 years traveling from Malacca in the west to New Guinea in the east, visiting island after island. To do what? Well, to get things like this. This is just a tiny smattering of the vast bird collection that Wallace eventually accumulated. But these are all, except for the bird of paradise under the glass dome, these are all actual Wallace specimens illustrated by artists after the bird skins were sent home. Far more numerous, of course, were the insects, because there's just a lot more of them. Wallace discovered many species. One of my favorite is perhaps the Raja Broke butterfly, which I got to see in Sarawak myself this year. I was absolutely mesmerized by it. And then there's a much smaller number of mammals, and also shells. I like to emphasize shells because they're always forgotten. That's not something that we tend to remember. But that was also part of the commercial collecting market. Now, note that the range of the natural world sampled by Wallace is actually remarkably narrow. If you compare to some of the things some of the other collectors were getting, they were getting lichens, fish, all manner of parts of the living world. Wallace's focus is quite narrow. Birds, insects, and a few other vertebrates. That was part of the commercial collecting market that he was supplying, and supplying in huge numbers. I don't have any, there are no drawings of Wallace in the field, but I've got some other Victorians just to show what he probably looked like out in the field. That one on the right is the famous German naturalist Ernst Haeckel. But another part of Wallace's story that I think needs to be changed is that Wallace isn't a lone hero. He doesn't have any slaves, but he does have an assistant named Ali. But it's much more than that. I'm actually working on an article now in which I'm going through all of Wallace's writings from his voyage in Asia and pulling out every reference to helpers and assistants. Just to get a new picture by changing the focus from being on Wallace to broadening it out to see how many people were actually involved in making his gigantic collection. Now, everyone repeats his impressive total of, 265,000 natural history specimens were accumulated over 8 years. But Wallace always had assistants and helpers, sometimes many. In fact, I'm not finished with my research, but I've got at least about 700 people I know helped Wallace. I don't know their names, but I know 7 porters carried his baggage up to this hill, 4 boatmen helped him down this river, and so on and so forth. So hundreds of people made Wallace's achievement possible. Most famous, of course, is our friend Ali, on the bottom right. That is Wallace's actual assistant, photographed in Singapore in 1862, just before Wallace was to say goodbye to him. And the figure in the top left might just possibly be Ali. Because I know that Ali, when he was traveling with Wallace and they were staying in the island of Ternate, Ali got married in 1859. And for a year, he didn't travel with Wallace. but stayed behind because his wife wouldn't let him go. So he continued collecting for Wallace nearby. Anyway, then he rejoined Wallace, and then Wallace returned home in 1862. Well, in around the turn of the century, around 1900, an American naturalist, Arthur Barber, I think was his name, visited Ternate, and an old man walked up to him in the street and said, "Hello, I am Ali Wallace." And he wrote to Wallace about this, and he also wrote this in his book. So we know that Ali returned to Ternate where his wife lived, and then he vanishes from history. But in my research, I found this photograph, which is perhaps from the 1870s, and it's labeled only "A Hunter in Ternate." I wonder if it's him. After all, Ali had been traveling with Wallace for years. He was an expert shot. He was an expert at preparing natural history specimens. He had made more money doing this than anything in his life. He was a very young man anyway. So perhaps it's not implausible that Ali carried on as a hunter. We know that local people worked in that field in different parts of the region. In Malacca, for example, there were people whose entire profession was simply producing natural history specimens, which they just sold commercially. You could go into a shop and buy dead stuffed birds if you wanted to, or butterflies. So not everything ended up in the Natural History Museum. So here's just a couple of images to give you a contemporary sense of what the equipment was like for collecting beetles and butterflies. Here's one of Wallace's notebooks. These are not drawings, by the way. I'm publishing these notebooks very soon. I've been working on these for almost a decade. They're not drawings, they're tracings. Wallace has put tracing paper on a book he did not own to trace some illustrations. He did this many times. And then he's pasted it into his notebook so he can take reproductions. Nowadays, of course, you just take out your phone and take a snap, but Wallace has made a tracing. Here's a Victorian painting showing an entomologist's auction. Not something we're probably very familiar with, but you can see there the customer is considering, well, he's looking at an insect. He's considering whether or not to buy it. This is the kind of place where Wallace's collections end up. They're auctioned. Some are kept for his personal collection, they're specially marked, and others end up in institutional collections, and others are owned by individual collectors, like himself. So you might have drawers like this. Some of these are Wallace's in the Natural History Museum. And some of them are downstairs. And here are some of Wallace's birds. He had special labels pre-printed in which he could add the name and the place where the bird was captured. Now all of those assistants spent, you have to imagine, 2 or 3 men working 6 days a week out in the forests with Wallace's guns and powder, shooting birds all day, all the time. Maximizing specimen production. It's like a factory production line. They bring in the birds, they skin them, they dry them, preserve them. Same with the insects. Wallace seems to have done most of the insects because that required a little bit more expertise. And almost any idiot can shoot a bird, at least with a shotgun. But the kinds of insects that he was collecting, I think, required his special expertise. But what this shows is that his English assistant, Charles Allen, who worked for him in the beginning, Ali, and these hundreds of other young men who worked for Wallace, how many specimens did they collect? So it's basically certain that Wallace collected only a tiny fraction of this enormous number of specimens that we always attribute to him. And that was just the way it was done back then. Ali is the one who discovered the new bird of paradise, named after Wallace, Wallace's standard wing. We know it when Wallace tells us this in his book. Wallace's assistant Charles Allen came and worked for him later as a sort of collector on his own. In other words, a sub-collector. So in the last year or so, Allen had his own team of assistants and then went off to islands that Wallace had not visited to gather more birds and animals. This enormous collection was put together, and Wallace is, as it were, the head of the firm. He's not a lone hero who collected everything by himself. And too often the story is told in that way, in which Wallace appears to be a superhuman collector. Here's another one of his notebooks showing some of his occasional sketches of birds. I chose this page because it says Singapore on the top. So birds collected at the top of the page, birds collected at Singapore and Malacca by Alfred Wallace. Very, very formal, even in his own private notebook. Whoops. You're not supposed to see that. I hit end instead of next. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. There we go. Sorry. So Wallace and his team, I should say, discovered many new species. Here's just a couple of the mammals. He discovered the rarest cat in the world, the Borneo Bay cat. Until a few years ago, there was still only 12 specimens ever collected, starting with his, which was the first one. He discovered the world's biggest bee, which lives on the island of Baka. He discovered the world's first flying frog. Of course, when I say he discovered, I should say a Chinese workman at the mines where he was staying discovered this and brought it to him. No doubt he got paid a penny or so, because the local workmen were constantly encouraged to bring him things, and he would give them money, a few pennies for a butterfly or whatever it was. So Wallace was given this frog and was told about its extraordinary behavior, that it glided on its outstretched feet pads and came down at an angle, and then Wallace wrote that down on the back of this drawing. Although he seems not to have collected it because the frog doesn't survive. But frogs weren't part of the commercial collecting trade, and they required storage in spirits, which is probably another reason why he didn't collect fish and other things like that. They would have been too expensive for Wallace. Oh, I did include a picture of my favorite butterfly. There we go. That's the Raja Brook. Absolutely stunning. And then, of course, there's this one with Wallace's charming description of the experience of capturing this. I'll just read it for you. The beauty and brilliancy of this insect are indescribable, and none but a naturalist can understand the intense excitement I experienced when I at length captured it. On taking it out of my net and opening the glorious wings, my heart began to beat violently. The blood rushed to my head, and I felt much more like fainting than I have done when in apprehension of immediate death. I had a headache the rest of the day. So great was the excitement produced by what will appear to most people a very inadequate cause. Indeed. That's a passionate naturalist. He's not just in it for the money. I don't mean to say that. Now, of course, nowadays we are troubled by Wallace's descriptions of shooting, and I would say, having read his diaries, with glee, shooting as many orangutans as possible. But the Victorians are not us. They didn't have our values. They didn't feel the way we do. And I think it's pointless to praise or condemn them when they happen to align with our particular views. I don't find that interesting. That's not the job of a historian. But he did shoot a lot of orangutans. And these were some of the most valuable specimens that he collected during his time in the region. Famously, he kept one as a baby for 3 months, hoping to raise it, but alas, it died. And this little bird is the only Wallace specimen, except for this exhibition, of course. This is the only Wallace specimen in Singapore. This is at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. And I have nicknamed it Wallace's Mystery Flycatcher because the label, the one on the top, that is Wallace's label in his handwriting, but it says collected in Malacca in 1862. But Wallace wasn't in Malacca in 1862. He was only there once, at the start of his voyage in 1854. So what's going on? And what is this bird doing in Singapore anyway? Why would you need a Wallace specimen of a bird that lives outside in the trees right now? I mean, they live here, they're native. Well, this is the solution. After Wallace returned home, he had a friend who bought up a large number of natural history specimens commercially prepared in Malacca. I told you there were these commercial collectors there. He sent the box of things to Wallace. The friend is not a naturalist, so Wallace is able to label what they are, sells them to his agent, and they split the money. This is yet another example of other people adding to the size of Wallace's collection. So for every butterfly and for every bird that he or his team collects, it's another penny in his piggy bank. And eventually he will be quite well off from all of this collecting. Oh, anyway, this bird was sold to one collector and then to another, and then it was sold to the Berlin Museum, which is where the second label is from. That's how we were able to track this down. Where it sat for about 80 years, and then in some specimen exchange between Raffles collection in Singapore and the Berlin Museum, this little bird, quite anonymously, came all the way back to where it had come from. And I'm sure nobody would have noticed that until many years later, probably in the 1970s or 80s, when the collection, somebody would have noticed that there's a Wallace specimen. Then it became something special, and ever since then it's been on special display. But that's the kind of story that every one of these little dead creatures probably has a story behind it, if only we knew what they were. One of Wallace's most charming stories is depicted in his book here with this illustration of a giant python being pulled out of his hut on the island of Ambon. And this tells you something else about Wallace. Wallace was no nonsense, right? There was a giant snake, and my men came and got it out and they killed it. Okay? That's the story of it. But I had been sleeping with this giant python in the rafters above me. Well, compare that to this man. This is American naturalist Albert Bickmore, who traveled also in Southeast Asia about the same time as Wallace. Well, here he is telling his own adventure with a giant python, in which he is forced to do battle for 20 minutes, armed only with an axe, versus the snake. Bickmore won, by the way. The snake lost. Now that's someone who's exaggerating to entertain his readers, as compared to Wallace's, I think, obviously unembellished account. And with all of his wanderings back and forth, and his collecting, and particularly his recording of exactly what lived where, he's always particularly interested in that, in distribution. He eventually came up with one of his greatest generalizations, which is the Wallace Line. This is his own map. See the red line there separating the Asian and Australian families, which is a very strange distribution pattern, because these families of animals are so different from each other, and yet the environments seem the same. They're in the same climate, under the same sun, the same seas. The rocks appear to be the same. Why was there different living things, so different, and yet right next to each other with just this narrow little line separating the two of them? Well, this couldn't be answered in Wallace's day, because they didn't know about plate tectonics. They didn't know that pieces of the Earth's crust can move sideways. They only knew it could go up and down. So Wallace theorized that there must have been two great supercontinents, a super Asia and a super Australia. It's a frightening prospect, isn't it? And they sunk. And so the islands that survive today are simply the high points of these lost continents, and hence their unrelated families of animals are stranded survivors. I don't need that illustration. Now, Wallace travels all the way out to this little island here called Ternate. Here's New Guinea, just so you can orient yourselves. This is Sulawesi. Out here because he wants to get to the islands around New Guinea, the only place in the world where one could acquire birds of paradise. This is what the little island looked like at the time he was there. But the most famous thing that happened in Wallace's life is about to occur on this little island. So he's here to get some of the most beautiful birds in the world. And we have some downstairs. Oh, here's the one discovered by Ali. Well, these have been treasured by local peoples for thousands of years. Well, Wallace was treasuring them too, just differently. They were matters of scientific commerce. Right? He was getting skins for sale and for science. And they would probably end up looking like that during someone's drawing. Well, so very famously, of course, as the story goes, Wallace is in bed with a fever, and he has a dramatic new idea. These are scenes from two different films showing Wallace's eureka moment when he thinks of natural selection. And this is where the real mythology and legends begin. Once Darwin and Wallace bump into each other, then things start going a bit haywire. Here is a painting from 1959 depicting the moment when Darwin receives the evolution essay from Wallace to Nazi. Now look at his expression. Intriguing. Now, if I were to show you screenshots of more recent films of this exact same moment, with each passing year, this becomes a more terrifying and distressing event for Darwin. In one of the scenes, I think it's an Australian one, he sort of just drops this bundle of papers. In another one, he's crying out, "Oh God, my whole life is ruined." It gets more distressing for Darwin as time goes on, which is why I like to show this older one, where it's not that big a deal. Okay, yes, very interesting. I've got this letter. Very well, let's carry on. What happened? Well, Wallace had written an essay that described a theory that sounded very much like Darwin's. Darwin had been working on his theory for 20 years. He hadn't published it yet. And he felt himself, as a Victorian gentleman, in a very awkward situation. He'd been given a paper by a young man he'd never met, which seemed to have the same theory. What should he do? So he asked his friends for advice. Sir Charles Lyell, Joseph Hooker. Lyell, I'm writing a book about this now, exactly how the Darwin and Wallace story has evolved and why has it become the way it is today as opposed to how it originally happened. Here too, the story is diverging more and more with each passing year. It gets more and more exciting. So for example, nowadays you routinely hear that Wallace's paper was published without his consent, or that they didn't ask for his permission. I'm try and play you a video clip, if this will work.
In the footsteps of one of the great forgotten heroes of natural history, Alfred Russel Wallace. And I'm on a mission to get Wallace the recognition he deserves.
They never even asked Wallace's permission to publish. The establishment weren't going to let their man lose priority, so they cooked up this connivance, which has been described at best as a delicate arrangement, or at worst, an ethically reprehensible cover-up. To me it's clear, Wallace was robbed. Wallace was robbed.
Okay, well, there you go. Bill Bailey is a brilliant comedian, but he's not a historian, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's all wrong. And this has been spinning off ever since the 1960s when one writer who had taken it upon herself to feel very cheated on Wallace's behalf was the first person to introduce the word consent, which she used incorrectly. She said it was published without his consent. Now Wallace had always written in his recollections that the paper was published without my knowledge. Is there a double echo? Yeah. And that's true, but in Victorian, you have to understand how the language was used back then. In Victorian language, to say something is published without my knowledge is not a complaint. It's a way of showing off. My work was so good, I didn't even have to send it for publication. They published it without my knowledge. And I have many instances of other people using the phrase in that way. So it's not a complaint. But it's only a modern person in the middle of the 20th century reading that and misunderstanding it and thinking that it's a complaint. Secondly, the Victorian conventions are very clear about how science worked. If you sent, as Wallace did, a fair copy, that is a cleanly written out essay to someone, and did not mark it private or say that it could not be published, it could be. These things were published every week in every scientific journal. It's completely standard. And this is what Darwin's colleagues did. So when Wallace heard the news months later that his paper had been read together with Darwin's at a meeting of the Linnaean Society, he was delighted. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And his name would be forever joined together with Darwin. Darwin had, at that moment that Wallace surprised him, he was about a year or two away from publishing his big book on his theory of evolution. And as you know, that book was put on hold, and instead he brought out a condensed, single volume overview of his theory called The Origin of Species. And this is the difference that Wallace made to Darwin's story. But now we're getting a different story. This is a cartoon from 2009 in which there were huge celebrations and commemorations all around the world for Darwin because of his bicentenary. And this cartoon is representing poor Wallace as forgotten. In fact, Daniel actually used the delightful phrase in the beginning of your talk. You said something about cheering the underdog or something like that. Yeah? Was it? I actually wrote it down. No, championing the underdog. Yes. And that's the moral of the story of Wallace, is that since the 1960s, Wallace has become represented as a new kind of figure, as an underdog hero, who is never mentioned without the word forgotten, that he's forgotten. Well, the idea that Wallace is forgotten is an invention. He's never been forgotten. He's always been part of this story. I could talk to you about any of hundreds of other Victorian collectors or naturalists that no one in this room has ever heard of, but I would never have to say that they were forgotten. It just wouldn't occur to me, or you, that I would refer to them as forgotten. But Wallace can never be talked about without being described as forgotten. Right? And now he cannot escape this martyrdom. And so, with time, Wallace's disadvantages increase. The amount that he was cheated or ripped off or lost the glory or the credit to Darwin and his cronies goes up. So the hardships increase, the way he is described. And the other thing that increases is Wallace's merit, Wallace's genius. He is now routinely referred to as the greatest field biologist of the 19th century. The father of biogeography. This is now ubiquitous. He's not. He's generations after biogeography has already been established. There are bookcases full of books on biogeography. He's not the founder of it, but it sounds great. Any great sounding label gets stuck on Wallace and will never go away. Yes, and forgotten and cheated by Darwin and so forth. And there's something about the way we like our heroes now. Darwin was the old kind of ideal hero. He was well born, he was wealthy, good reputation, all that sort of thing, right? But he doesn't fit the bill so much anymore. People are a bit embarrassed to applaud Darwin. You don't want to applaud the man who has everything. It doesn't feel right. Whereas a forgotten underdog hero, God, you feel great when you say, oh, poor Wallace is forgotten. Like Bill Bailey. I'm here to get him his due. I'm here to set the record straight. I'm going to fix it for Wallace because he's unfairly suffered in the face of famous Mr. Darwin and so on. Well, the problem is that maybe that's just not true. Wallace, after he read Darwin's book, wrote this little description going on and on about how much he admired it. Darwin wasn't just richer and more privileged than Wallace, he was, but he did also do all the work. Darwin had worked for 20 years to produce The Origin of Species, and it was that one book that convinced the international scientific community within a radically short period of time, of about a decade or so, that evolution was not a stupid, ridiculous idea, but was a fact. And that has not been scientifically at issue since the 1870s. This was single-handedly done by Darwin's book. So as much credit as we want to give Wallace, and hooray, let's give him all we can, he did not contribute one letter to that book or to the Darwinian Revolution. He was one of Darwin's strongest allies and always supported Darwin. And they remained friends for the rest of their lives. There's Wallace just before he's leaving Singapore. So by the time he got home, he was a wealthy man, finally. All those natural history specimens had added up, particularly the orangutans. And so he was a wealthy man, although he later sadly blew most of his money. And it was only in 1869 that he wrote his wonderful book of travels to the Malay Archipelago. Oh, next myth, this book has never been out of print. I've even repeated that myself, actually. That turns out to be also false. The book stopped being printed in 1922. It was not printed thereafter for many decades. But it's another one of these positive sound bites that makes Wallace sound good. His book's never been out of print. Sadly it has. But it's back in print again, so I hope you'll all read it. So indeed, I will finish on this more positive note of Darwin and Wallace, friends now and always. Thank you.
I'll start, John, with you. And in relation to Wallace's story and this whole myth versus legend, what really is behind creating that myth versus legend? You know, what do you think is happening?
I think it's part of a broader movement that has been happening since the 1960s, in which very common themes are redressing past wrongs, setting things right, and so on and so forth. So the Darwin-Wallace case is one of very many examples in which you've got a famous historical figure, and then a counterfoil is found who is said to be the forgotten, real deserving person. Right? And a perfect, complete parallel is Florence Nightingale, the founding mother of modern nursing, yes, foundress of modern nursing, versus Mary Seacole, a black Jamaican lady who went also to the Crimean War. And it's absolutely, everything that's happening in their story is the same as what's happening in Darwin and Wallace. And there are many other examples of this. So it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the historical evidence or merit of the stories. It's that some kinds of stories sell better today. They tug at the heartstrings in a way that didn't happen before. So that seems to me to be why this particular story has evolved in that direction, and it's still evolving. I mean, every year, some new factoid is made up about Wallace to make him an even more exalted super genius, or to increase the terrible, backstabbing, evil wrongs done to him. So either he's suffered more, or he is greater, or both. But these two themes are at the bottom of all these new things said about Wallace. So he has departed now, in my opinion, so radically from the original historical figure in his story that it's almost unrecognizable.
So alternative facts have been around for a very long time, is what you're saying?
Indeed.
Good. But yes, there have been a lot of debates about Wallace and Darwin and yeah, the sort of, I don't know, anti-hero. And I'd be interested to know a bit more about what is real and what is fiction. But everybody loves an underdog at the end of the day. And Darwin had money and Wallace didn't. And, so you've got to love that.
Is that true? That Wallace had none?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just making sure we're accurate.
Okay, I have to ask this question about the assistants, of course. You point out to the hundreds of people who would have been needed to help Wallace, and that's very exciting to position the lens under which we see Wallace's collection. And I'd like to expand on that a little bit in thinking, especially in the way Wallace writes his book on, the Malay Archipelago compared to, it's not a fair comparison because they're two different books, but the most famous book by Wallace is his account of his travels, and then Darwin's is his Origin of Species. But what Wallace does is really talk about the people that he encounters daily, and that's what I find one of his strong points. Now, when we go back to the assistants, if we do acknowledge that so many of them helped him in every day, how do you think this daily interaction with people around him, which were not the people he had from England, the natives, how would that have influenced how he viewed the world and how it influenced his collection and his thinking about the world, which is obviously what he did because he came up to also the same theory as Darwin. So indirectly, I'm not saying they would have, how would that influence how he was thinking about the world?
Yes, well, I think it vastly enriched Wallace's knowledge and experience of this part of the world. It's important to remember, of course, that there isn't just one type of human called a local or a native. Wallace is traveling amongst many, many different ethnicities, groups, languages. And he's learning different things from all of them. One thing he does that is usually forgotten is he recorded vocabularies everywhere he went. So he had lists of words. Every time he encountered some new group, some new language group, he would ask them, his informants, to tell him all of these different words in their languages, and he kept these notebooks full of things. So we've been talking about the natural history specimens, but the other thing that Wallace was doing was, of course, he was a sort of ethologist or anthropologist, and he's studying the peoples very carefully, recording the different ways that they dress, the different social rules they have in different places, how the peoples vary. So for Wallace, he's not just studying the birds and the butterflies, but he's also studying the peoples. And so when he publishes the Malay Archipelago, it is explicitly a book about lands and peoples amongst whom he traveled. So yeah, Wallace was not an isolated figure traveling around by himself. He's with communities of people, and he's passing through communities. Without them, he wouldn't have accomplished anything.
But isn't that the way of it for all of us, really?
I suppose you're right.
Yeah.